Welcome to Unstitching ADHD, where we examine learning differences through a real-world and culturally responsive lens. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Ekiyor, and today we have an incredible, inspiring guest, Miss Rebecca Bruening. She is a reading specialist, a scholar, an advocate whose personal journey from a struggling reader to literacy expert continues to empower students and educators nationwide. Today we are diving into neurodiversity and multilingual learners and what it truly means to support students who think and learn differently. Let's welcome Ms. Rebecca Bruening to the show. Ms. Bruening, thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
So, your story is remarkable, and I think it sets the tone for this entire conversation we'll be having today. So, let's start at the beginning. How would you describe your journey from struggling reader to reading specialist?
Well, my story basically began when I was very young, first, second grade. School was very difficult for me. I could not read when I was in the third grade. I flunked language arts in the sixth grade. And it was very difficult with keeping control. And I was always being told, don't be too much. And so forth. I was actually one of those kids always in the nurse's station, always trying to avoid school. One of my major key memories from being young was I had a second grade teacher who had this rule that if you could pass a practice spelling test on Wednesday, then you didn't have to take the test on Friday. And I tried so hard every single time and I never could do it. So very young, I immediately was like, I'm different. School is just very hard. I eventually moved to a different school district where the teacher identified me with having issues in the classroom. So they evaluated me, and I was diagnosed with having a learning disability in reading, writing, and math. And so in the middle of the school year, because that particular school didn't have a resource room, which is where they pull kids out to give more direct instruction, they had to ship me across town to a new school. At that point, the kids were very much labeled special ed by the teachers and by the students. It was very difficult kind of growing up, struggling with reading and writing and math. But then I eventually moved on to having some excellent teachers that really put me on the road to increasing my reading. My math still stayed a major struggle while I was younger. Going on further, I got into high school and I was immediately tracked. So this was before No Child Left Behind. So, and not that, that I'm saying that's a fantastic law or anything, but previously you were tracked. You either went to the honors classes, academic courses, which was preparing you for college, or you were put into the general courses where everybody else went. And it was my freshman year and I was going through general classes. I spoke up and I said, I don't know if I want to go to college, but I'd like the opportunity to try. So I went to my teachers and I got most of them recommended and I got moved into some academic courses, except for math. Math was something that was very much a struggle. As I was working with my reading and my math, I was able to move forward through high school. Although I had some amazing teachers, I did have one negative when I was in high school. I really always felt the need to prove myself. Those of us who are on an IEP, individual education plan, or labeled when they're younger, usually have that perfectionist, like you want to be seen as being smart. I applied for the National Honor Society in my school. And at first they said I could not apply because I was in resource classes for math. I countered and said, I do that because my IEP says I have to have that. I advocated for myself and I was able to get into the National Honor Society. During the ceremony, I was given the certificate, like all my teachers are there, my parents are there. I was very happy. I'm in the National Honor Society and maybe I can prove I'm finally smart, because you always have that moment. And they handed me the certificate and on the certificate it said honorary member. And I remember looking at that picture and at that moment I still felt, okay, well, I still have to prove myself. I still have to prove that I'm not too much. I'm not dumb. And so it was a very difficult moment for me, but I had an excellent guidance counselor and he really wanted me to go to college. He was like, "Listen, just go to college, take some courses, see what you want to do." And he really pushed me and got me a scholarship to the local community college for a year with free books. I went and just started, and someone mentioned, "Well, hey, you're really good with people and kids, and you've been through the special education world yourself as an individual." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I have." And so I decided to become a special education teacher, an intervention specialist in my field. So I got my bachelor's in special education. And then I got into my second or third year of teaching. And I came across students that I was teaching middle school and they couldn't read first grade level text. I mean, we're talking some very difficult, intensive reading needs here. And I had no idea what to do. I felt like a failure all over again, that moment to try to prove yourself. And so I did what I've always done. I kind of looked out, how can I find some information to help these children? And I stumbled upon a grad program at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was specifically for a master's in reading science. They offered a couple extra things, the reading endorsement, and you could do an extra practicum to get a dyslexia certification endorsed by the International Dyslexia Association. And so I took it. I said, I got to know how to help these kids. I have to help them not feel like they're worthless, because they're not. But when you grow up like that and you're constantly faced with failure, 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 it throws you. And it was around around as a few years later, I had come to find that my current medications were not working. Ever since I was younger, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Through my 20s, I couldn't afford health insurance, so I was off meds for quite a bit of that time. But then once I was able to get myself on medication again for anxiety and depression, they weren't working as well. And it was okay. I was having anxiety and different things. And then I heard a podcast, actually. That's why I was so excited to come on a podcast, because I feel that the podcast world is so important. It was actually the Mel Robbins podcast. And they had talked about there's this whole generation of women called the Lost Generation from the 90s. And they are women who are not diagnosed with ADHD. Because back then, well, just even now, the rates is like 2 to 3 times more likely are boys diagnosed than girls. She was labeling off things, emotional regulation, fidgeting, issues with working memory, like a whole bunch of things. And I was like, that's me. That's me. That's me. So I switched psychiatrists and I talked to them and I said, hey, do you think maybe we've been going about this the wrong way? And so they did the assessment, and lo and behold, I'm not just too much, I'm just neurodivergent. So we changed up some meds and I switched therapists to someone who specialized in ADHD. And I'm going to tell you, since changing the therapeutic means that I've gone about, my life has completely changed. I see myself as more than just someone who's too much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Your story reminds me of what generated my passion. It takes one person, a teacher, a counselor, just like Ed Alloway, that he has dyslexia and ADHD. And, it took his second grade teacher to make him realize that his style of learning is different. It's not less than.
Exactly.
Today is a psychiatric doctor and he's an expert in ADHD. So you coming up here, it's really an honor. Your journey really highlights the importance of self-understanding. That brings me to something many listeners are eager to learn about: your own neurodiversity. The first time it really occurred to you, I know you touched on it a little bit, how best, not just only that you're neurodivergent, but how best your brain works.
One of the things that I always try to think about is, how can I go about being successful? Because I've always felt that I had, the negatives that we go, with ADHD. And the first times I started realizing what I needed was in therapy, where I was talking with one of my doctors and so forth, well, with my counselor, and just reflecting. When I really started realizing what I needed to be successful was the more I learned about neurodiversity and dyslexia and ADHD and autism goes on that path as well through there. Learning about executive functioning and how it affects your emotions, because everyone always thinks it's just attention, but it really comes down to emotional regulation and exactly how ADHD works in the brain, which I'll touch on a little bit later as we go forward. So that's when I really started to, but it wasn't until my 30s, until like my 30s and 40s, I really started to see, okay, this is what I need in order to be okay. Because I would look around and see everybody else being completely fine. And I would be like, what about me? Why do I think differently like this?
That perspective is so powerful. And I want to believe it also shapes the way you support students today. How has being a neurodivergent shaped your approach to supporting students with ADHD or dyslexia?
It has completely affected my approach going about it. When it comes to ADHD and dyslexia as well, when it comes to ADHD, people look at it as you have a deficit in attention, hence the term attention deficit, but actually you have a superpower in attention. All right, that's really what it is. And I've actually sat down with families and I've explained it has to do with the dopamine issues that are going on in the prefrontal cortex of your brain. I try not to get too in depth with the brain science, but with your transponders and your receptors, it's basically an uneven reward. So if your dopamine is low, your push is low, your perseverance becomes low, and your emotions, which is one of the reasons why I noticed that when my dopamine goes low, I get depressed for absolutely no apparent reason. I'll notice that. When I work with students, I immediately recognize the avoidance that is there. It's not laziness, it's cognitive overload. So, especially when you have middle school and high school students who have already seen quite a bit of failure. Most of us will say we learn so much from failure, and I agree. But when you have so much failure, it kind of creates this view of yourself. And you're always trying to prove that you're not a failure. So, when I work with students, I really emphasize the relationship. Every teacher says building a relationship is important, but I let them know my story. That's the very first day of school. I put up a slideshow and I say, hey, I had an IEP. I flunked language arts in the 7th grade. I couldn't read in 3rd grade. And this is me. I had a goal, I persevered, and I got to it. Then I asked them to tell me their why. And we sit down and we actually brainstorm. And I guess you could call it a vision board, but I asked them specifically, like, what do you see yourself doing? What do you want? What restaurants do you want to eat at when you grow up? Where do you want to live? What kind of lifestyle do you want? What is your desire? I create like a project where we sit down, we break through that. And when I do that, I say, if you want to own the Bugatti, which a lot of the middle school boys are like, I want to own a Bugatti. I say, well, you have to do A, B, and C. This is the path to get there. And literacy unlocks that. It really does. College, especially when kids say, oh, I want to go to college, so much of college is reading and very technical reading too, academic reading. So that's one of the very first things I do is I get them to go that way. Another thing that I've really leaned into is structured literacy. And that's not just for just people with dyslexia. People with ADHD benefit so much from structured literacy. It is a way of teaching that is very structured, hence the term structured literacy, but it's very explicit. And it goes in a systematic and cumulative format, kind of an up-down approach, as you go. And I can go more into what structured literacy looks like, but it's being more explicit and it really helps all neurodivergence.
I say most times everybody will benefit from structures like that. So there are so many misconceptions out there, especially in urban, rural, multilingual communities, right? What do you think educators often misunderstand about ADHD and reading challenges?
Well, the thing that educators will very much misunderstand is, and it's not their fault, most teachers go into because they really want to help children. And you go in there, you really want to see them succeed. One of the problems with my profession is that sometimes we get more into the opinion side of what we think works and not as much as the science side of what works. The thing with science, and I think you understand this, is that science is always changing because we're always gaining more information. We're always learning more. We know more about the brain now than we have in hundreds of years. The stuff that's coming out, especially out some of the Harvard research about dyslexia that Pat posted this summer, a lot of times we pick things because we think it's going to work, but we have to really look at the research with how we're going. Another thing with educators is sometimes we will think that a kid is being defiant or they're being lazy or they just don't want to do it and they don't care. And really with ADHD, it's because we don't have enough dopamine. Dopamine does everything. It does task initiation, working memory, cognitive load, and everything. And so when a student is having trouble regulating that dopamine in their prefrontal cortex, they literally just can't do it. I know personally when I had to read some very non entertaining books through college, sitting there and I can, I've gotten my reading skills have improved. I really struggled to get through the text. Students with ADHD, we also will struggle quite often. I think another thing that teachers really need to understand is that there's a comorbidity when it comes to being neurodivergent. Okay. So 25 to 40% of kids who have ADHD may have dyslexia. All right. And if you even go in about 12 to 40% that have ADHD possibly might have autism as well. So there's a lot of things that are going on there. And I think that teachers really need to understand and be able to pick up on that it's not just because you have one ADHD kid, it's going to look different with another because there are three different types. There's three different types of ADHD. We have the hyperactive impulsive, we have the inattentive, and then the combo. A lot of times girls will have that inattentive, which is why they won't get diagnosed with ADHD as often. The hyperactive and the impulsive will get seen a lot more with that. So I think that that's really what teachers need to kind of look for with that.
When you've seen one person with ADHD, you've seen just one person with ADHD.
Amen.
I like that. That brings us right into practice. You've touched a little bit about it. The day-to-day work teachers face in the classroom from your experience, not just as a student, but for now a practitioner, right? How can teachers better recognize and support students who may have both ADHD and dyslexia, the comorbid or co-occurring, as most times is described?
So I look at it in two ways. Let's go down the reading part first. Okay. So when you have a child or a person who has ADHD or dyslexia and they're a struggling reader, you should go about a struggling reader in basically the same way. First thing we have to do is we have to figure out why are they struggling? All right. Because giving just random interventions, not to say random like this is not caring, but different things are not going to fix what's going on unless we know exactly where it is. So first thing that we usually end up doing is we assess whether or not the kid is reading on grade level. Okay, so you can, and these are free resources too, and parents can use these as well. You can go on to Dibbles or Acadians online. These are I forget what Dibbles stands for off the top of my head, but they're a diagnostic form. Okay, and what you do is you can give them something called a maze assessment, which will let you know if kids are reading on grade level. They take out little portions as they're reading, usually syntactic portions like word meaning. If kids can circle the correct words, they can tell you that they're making sense on the sentence level. Now, when you have a kid who's struggling there, next thing I would test is oral reading fluency. We have to see if the student is being able to read a certain number of words per minute. What we're testing for is if they are struggling to decode or with the fluency of it, because the brain, we like to do multitasking, but the brain really doesn't like to do that. So the cognitive overload comes when you have to break down, do the fluency, and understand at the same time. And kids that have to do that, it's very difficult with reading. So if fluency is low, we can go in there and see, okay, why is fluency low? And it's the oral reading fluency. There is a formula called the simple view of reading. It's word recognition times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. We're testing both sides. We're going to test your word recognition with that oral reading fluency, and we're going to test your language comprehension with that maze. And we need to see which side is having an issue. Now, both sides could have an issue. We'd have to make a plan for that. But if you have a kid who has a word recognition problem and you give them intervention on vocabulary, or you give them intervention on picking out the main idea, that's not going to help them because they can't read the words, and vice versa. So the first thing that we have to do in the literacy world is we have to go, okay, what is the actual problem? Not diagnose, like say you have ADHD, that you have dyslexia, but what is your actual struggle and how can we help there? That's like the very first area that I would suggest with teachers. You got to figure out how, what is the actual reading problem? Because saying, oh, the kids can't read, that's not going to help you. The second side of helping kids, especially with dyslexia and ADHD, is to teach them the why first. Okay. Very important. And it's very important for anybody, most teenagers in general, but especially if you have ADHD, you need to have dopamine to do anything. So you need to get that passion going because ADHD, we've been talking about a lot of negative stuff. We are amazingly passionate people. When we throw into our passion, we can achieve almost anything. We need to know, why is this connected to what I want to do? It's very important that we do that. The second part is, if we know someone has ADHD or dyslexia, we need to support them cognitively because their working memory is not working as well as everybody else's. Somebody with ADHD usually has about 80 to 85% issues. I'm sorry, people who have 80 to 85% of people with ADHD have some kind of working memory issue. And working memory is one of the core things you need to be able to read appropriately. When that's out of whack, it is very difficult to retain, to be able to do anything that you need with that.
I love this. And that's a quote from what you just said that came into my mind now. We love multitasking, but the brain does not like multitasking.
Which is not.
I love that way of putting it. Thanks. So, within that conversation, multilingual learners deserve special attention. What unique challenges do multilingual learners with ADHD or dyslexia face, and how can schools better serve them based on your experience?
Based on my experience, I do have a TESOL, which is for teaching English as a second language.
Mhm.
I work with a very high population of multilingual learners, and a good chunk of my multilingual learners have ADHD and dyslexia. So it's something that I see quite frequently. One of the major challenges is that this group of people get over-identified and under-identified. For many years, multilingual learners would come in and sometimes get over-identified in special education because a lot of the language issues were coming into play. And then the pendulum kind of swung the other way, where sometimes we won't identify someone with dyslexia or ADHD who is multilingual because we don't want to put them in special education because of a language problem. Right now in the United States, we're able to, at the age of 4, with 90 to 95% accuracy, diagnose dyslexia. This past summer, Harvard came out with a research study that is showing, early research that says that we might be able to find genetic markers of dyslexia at 18 months old. So the thing is, early intervention, early identification is so important because that's when the brain is most plastic, malleable. Blech. So I said that word that way, but that's one of the reasons why we really want to try to help at that age. You can learn to read at any age. In my practice, I'm working with people who are 27, 30 years old, and they're trying to learn. But it's a lot more plastic at that age. For multilingual learners, sometimes they will not get diagnosed until much later. Another thing with multilingual learners is English has a very deep orthography, which means that there is a lot to English. It's a difficult language to learn. English has something called 44 phonemes, and a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. Spanish has about 22 to 24. Spanish is more of a one-to-one kind of language. There aren't really a lot of vowel teams in Spanish that you have to memorize. In English, there's like 5 different ways to say long A, especially people who come from Latin-based languages kind of struggle with. And I worked with some people who came from Mandarin last year, and they that whole thing has to come into with tonal differences when they're speaking. It can be quite a challenge because of that. So I wanted you to think about this and see this in your head with this, is that if you have somebody who's dyslexic, and let's just, throw in ADHD for fun, and they're learning a language. Dyslexic children typically really struggle with learning language because dyslexia kind of affects in the brain in Broca's area where language kind of takes place. And so that's where we learn our language, hear about the sounds, we're able to manipulate the sounds and move the sounds. So if you're dyslexic and you are trying to learn a language and having issues with the phonological portion, and then you're ADHD and you're having issues with your working memory because you have to move from working memory to long memory, it becomes very difficult to learn at the same pace as peers. In school, we are tested on academic language. What you and I are doing right now is conversational English. And a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I'm fluent. I'm conversational. I can do it. It's great. But they sit down to read an academic book in the language they've learned. And it's an entirely different story because we speak in simple sentences, sometimes compound sentences. We don't speak in compound, complex sentences like the ones that have commas and semicolons and parentheses and just and all the different things there. And so if you add all of those together, it becomes a very much a struggle if you are ADHD or dyslexic or of any kind of learning disability and you're trying to learn a language.
You know, I'm so happy that you're here today. Your work also represents something deeply personal, right?
Mhm.
Visibility and representation. What does it mean to you personally to be a model of success for students who learn differently?
I think any of your listeners out there who have ADHD would come to understand that thinking I'm a model of success, I feel a little imposter syndrome, even though my husband reminds me, look at your resume, you're not an imposter. But you still have that. I still sometimes see that little girl in second grade trying to pass that Wednesday spelling test, or that teenager walking across the stage with that honorary certificate for the National Honor Society. My logical side of my brain says, be quiet. You're smart. You've done so much. What it means to me is that I'm able to show people that no matter what kind of brain you're born with, you can do great things. And you need to embrace that. Sure, there are negatives. There are many negatives of dyslexia and ADHD, but there are so many positive, the creativity, the passion. And when you grow up, most of adulting is thinking outside the box. Those of us who have that, we think outside the box all the time. I think my greatest thing is I like to send messages that, ADHD people, we have to find that spark and we have to follow that passion, chase the dopamine, as we've kind of coined that in ADHD, because there's great perseverance and there's great grit, which is what we really need to cling to on that.
Thank you for that. A wise person once said to me, you know, disability is created in and around the environment. We decide to define what negative is because we have created environments that highlight those negatives, right? I always tell people, imagine, for instance, if somebody with ADHD or dyslexia designed most of our environments, most of us will be those who claim to be neurotypical will be on medication to survive, right? So somebody created the environment and decided this is what is normal without taking certain styles of learning and thinking into consideration. If you don't think this way, it's a negative, right? And that is why I love to highlight guests like you who are living witnesses to the fact that we just need to change our approach to education because there's a lot of power, a lot of strength, a lot of, why everybody functions best when they are exposed to something they are interested. So if interest is what gets somebody with ADHD or to really participate, and want to know more. Why is that so difficult to do? For me, the environment has decided to design something that suits certain groups of people, and any person who doesn't fit into that class now is defined as a negative. So before we close, I want to leave listeners with something actionable, right? What advice would you give to educators or students who are just beginning to understand their own learning differences?
The first thing I would say is to ditch the shame. Now, there's a wonderful speaker, Brene Brown, and she talks a lot. Her research is a lot into shame, and her big thing is that shame thrives in silence. Naming it breaks it. So a lot of times I'll say to people, "Hi, I'm Rebecca Bruening. I have ADHD and I am neurodivergent, just so you're aware." And it gives you strength. Naming things gives you strength. So something I would tell somebody definitely is to drop the shame and make a list. Have 3 columns. Your first column are your strengths. Write them down. You have them. Okay. Talk to your friends because we're very self critical. Make a list of all your positives. Then make a list of your struggles and be realistic. Self reflection can be hard. In the third column, write what you need to support those struggles to turn them into strengths. And don't have shame to needing that support because that is the whole point of life, to figure out what you need in order to be successful. I stumbled upon Google Keep note-taking checklist thing, and because I was terrible at remembering things when I went to the grocery store, like that was one of my struggles. And so I used that quite frequently. I used to feel shame because I needed help. And that's one of the things we need to put to the side. I actually started my own business, the reading hacker, trying to bring reading strategies to families and teachers. And I'm sure there's somebody online that coined it, but I can do hard things. So when I get to a point where I get overwhelmed, and those of you with ADHD will understand that overwhelm, you get this, you're lost in the forest. I say to myself, my husband says it to me too, I can do hard things. And I sit down and I go, okay, what is the first step? Where am I going? So keeping that in mind, reflect on what you're good at, think about how you can support your struggles, and remember that you can do hard things. We all can.
Thank you. We all can do hard things, but we all do them differently, right? We all come to do hard things. No one way of doing hard things is right, as long as it's done, right?
Exactly.
Now, this is the part I hate in this whole show, when it's coming to an end, especially when I have guest experts like you. Now, for my listeners, those sitting down and wondering, how can they reach out to you, your website, and all that information, so listeners can continue this conversation directly with you?
Oh, no problem. So, like I said, I've coined myself Rebecca Bruening. I'm the reading hacker.
Mhm.
And with my website, I said www.thereadinghacker.com. And I'm also been doing, I'm actually based in Ohio, but I've been doing local presentations at libraries, at resource centers. I want to give parents and teachers as much information as they can so that they can help their own families and their classrooms. You can reach out to me on Facebook, The Reading Hacker. I'm also on Instagram and on LinkedIn. I'm available for consultation, for coaching for parents, for kids, for teachers. I recently became an adjunct instructor at Ashland University, so I'll be able to be doing some more professional developments for teachers. But my real goal with the Reading Hacker is to teach people how to hack reading, because most people, when you say go learn to read, they're extremely overwhelmed. But if I say I have a few hacks for you, everybody can handle a hack. Feel free to reach out, email, and I will eventually be starting in the next few months a newsletter on Substack.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bruening, for your wisdom, expertise, vulnerability, and advocacy. Your work reminds us that learning differences are not deficits. They are simple different paths to brilliance. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Unstitching ADHD Urban Ed Talks. If today's conversation resonated with you, Share it with an educator, a parent, or a student who needs to hear it. And remember, when we understand how the brain learns, we unlock the full potentials of every child. Until next time, I want you to remember, the sun is behind the cloud. It will always shine for those who are persistent, consistent, and resilient. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep on stitching the narratives around ADHD, dyslexia, and all forms of neurodiverse learning styles. Thank you.